So thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here in Riga. It's my first visit and also a privilege to be addressing this conference. So thank you very much for having me. Yes, my topic is Bartók and the topic of drunkenness. I've already been asked, is this a case of practice-based research? Anyway, drunkenness is generally not considered to be socially acceptable. In the UK, there is a criminal charge for being drunk and disorderly. It's defined by Gray & Company solicitors as being, quotation, a person who in any public place is guilty of behaving in a disorderly manner whilst under the influence of alcohol. This means that the police can arrest you if they deem you to be creating a public disturbance whilst drunk. And we've no doubt all experienced the social discomfort engendered if a guest at a dinner party becomes embarrassingly drunk. Philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin wrote at length on the phenomenon of the carnival. Interesting that one of the pieces we've just heard was called Carnival. I didn't expect that link between the two presentations. Anyway, he wrote at length on the phenomenon of carnival as typified by the Roman Saturnalia and later medieval carnivals. He wrote, quotation, the laws, prohibitions and restrictions that determine the structure and order of ordinary, that is non-carnival life, are suspended during carnival. What is suspended first of all is hierarchical structure and all the forms of terror, reverence, piety and etiquette connected with it, that is, everything resulting from socio-hierarchical inequality among people. Bakhtin identifies 4 types of carnival behaviour, and these are a new mode of interrelationship between individuals, eccentricity, carnivalistic misalliance, and profanation. It is the second of these, eccentricity, that concerns us here, and this, according to Bakhtin, permits in concretely sensuous form the latent sides of human nature to reveal and express themselves. Bakhtin does not actually mention drunkenness specifically, but in most carnival settings, and certainly in the Roman Saturnalia, eating, drinking were commonplace, along with concomitant drunkenness. Stalibras and White contends that, again another quotation, in the long-term history, from the 17th to the 20th century, there were literally thousands of acts of legislation which attempted to eliminate carnival and popular festivity from European life. And Bakhtin proposes that the carnival legacy has been largely preserved in literature. He writes, from the second half of the 17th century on, carnival almost completely ceases to be a direct source of carnivalization, ceding its place to the influence of already carnivalized literature. The 2 writers that Bakhtin considers to be of particular relevance in this context are Rabelais and Dostoevsky. So by the displacement from everyday life to literary conceit, what is socially unacceptable outside of carnival context becomes not only socially but also artistically acceptable to society. So where does Bartók fit into all this? Firstly, the focal piece of this presentation is the second of his 3 burlesques, opus 8c. According to the Shorter Oxford Dictionary, a burlesque is, and this is a quotation, an action or performance which casts ridicule on that which it imitates, or a mockery, indicating close parallels with carnival behaviour, which inverts normal relationships and practices. Bakhtin does not discuss carnivalist behaviour as captured in music, yet there is a tradition. Naturally, there are plenty of instances of music celebrating drinking. One thinks of the various brindizes that occur in Verdi's operas. But these all fall really within the socially acceptable side of drinking and do not fit Bakhtin's eccentric behaviour category. There is, however, a rather lesser tradition of representing the socially unacceptable side of drinking, inebriation or drunkenness in music. An early example of this comes in Heinrich Bieber's Battaglia for string orchestra, during which there is a section called The Dissolute Society of Common Humour, which depicts drunkenness by means of polytonality and, in some performances, the use of sliding as well. So we'll hear a little bit of that. The idea, quite amazing really to think that that was written in the second half of the 17th century. There is also the third movement of Mahler's First Symphony, the second theme of which has been likened by Jakob Beasley to the music of a drunken klezmer band. And then there is the present case, the second of Bartók's three burlesques for piano, which the composer heads with the words, "a little tipsy." Here we can see a parallel with the literization of Carnival in that in these three portrayals, drunkenness is no longer a part of society, but is rather presented as a reflection on an undesirable aspect of society. Thus, by a process of artistic amelioration, drunkenness becomes both socially and artistically acceptable, presenting the humorous aspects in a way that will entertain but not threaten the audience, which is now one stage removed from the source. So, can drunkenness become a topic in music? Raymond Monell's oft-quoted criteria for topical status are that a musical feature should have signification by association, indexicality is another way of describing that, and a level of conventionality. In two of the cases cited earlier, the indexicality is provided by the composer's own text descriptions. So there is really no problem here. In the third case, the Mahler, and there are no doubt others, a musicologist has heard a representation of drunkenness in a piece of music and described a label accordingly. So what have these three cases got in common to enable the composers and an informed listener to arrive at the referent? I think one can say that musical instability is the common factor. Tonality, in the case of the Bieber, rhythm and tempo in the case of Mahler and Bartók. But does this give them conventionality? Clearly, a listener who does not know the pieces might not, on first hearing them, immediately think of inebriation, although conceivably they might. But this is actually true of most topics. Even in the 18th century, where topic theory is probably at its most clear-cut, topical listening relied on prior knowledge and education. So I would argue that the same is true of what I'm calling the topic of drunkenness. It is recognized by those in the know and is likely to spread as the music gains circulation. So how can one project the topic of drunkenness in performance? Earlier, we heard Philip Pickett's performance of the relevant section of Bieber's Battaglia. Here, Pickett takes a topical cue and firstly adopts a slower tempo than some other performances and adds these string slides, thereby making the music sound even more drunk than you're likely to hear in some other accounts. In the case of Bartók's second burlesque, which, as I've told you, the composer marks a little tipsy, there is much more aid to hand. There is the piano score, dating from 1911, the composer's own recording, dating from 1929, and the orchestral transcription made in 1931, when it became the fourth of the composer's 6 Hungarian pictures. By far the plainest of these is the solo piano score. Bartók's recording adds many interpretive features not indicated in that score, but he does include them, many of them, in the orchestral transcription. So my own approach is twofold. To project the topic, so that it is unmistakable to an initiated listener, but to preserve musical coherence at the same time. In other words, to balance extroversive and introversive elements. The first big difference between the piano score and the orchestral score is the tempo. The piano score indicates an opening tempo of allegretto crotchet equals somewhere between 104 and 112, so there's some latitude. Whereas the orchestral score indicates allegretto rubato, crotchet equals 80. So we're at the fastest end, it's something like this. At the slower end, so on. So quite a difference there. Bartók's recorded performance adopts the latter, rather than the former, although as befits drunken manoeuvres, his beat is not steady. The piano score does show rubato in brackets, as you can see on screen, but clearly Bartók felt the need to give this aspect more prominence when he recorded the piece and orchestrated it. In terms of representing drunkenness or instability, a slower tempo allows more scope for speeding up and slowing down, according to the inherent feel or humour of the music. In any case, inebriates don't tend to move quickly, nor are their steps steady. Most performances, both pianistic and orchestral, introduce fluctuations in the beat and the tempo in many places. Actually, the piano score does not really indicate any significant changes of speed, whereas the orchestral score includes many. For example, the rising and falling chords in bar 10 are marked, as you can see on screen, accelerando, followed by, fairly quickly, rallentando. After this, a general accelerando commences around bar 12, reaching crotchet equals 112 by bar 16. Bartók broadly follows this in his recording, although, for example, he omits the ritz that we see on screen in the second half of bar 10. My own solution here is not to do a general accelerando, so in this instance I'm following the piano score rather than the orchestral score or the Bartók recording, but I do include small fluctuations of tempo which do reflect the kind of drunken progress of the subject. In the middle section of this piece, the drunk seems to stop trying to walk and attempts to sing. And you get a little bit of vocal phrase on the last bar on the screen there. Later on again. András Schiff regards these as perhaps fragments of operetta, though strangely enough, when I was discussing this with another friend, he heard plain chant, and I can sort of see why, because of the parallelism of it, but the context of it, I'm not totally convinced by, I have to say. I think operetta is actually more likely, or popular song of some sort. Clearly there is a singing topic going on there, though. Bartók barely changes the tempo in his recording. In fact, he even speeds up for one of the snatches of song, although he doesn't play any of them evenly. Personally, I think a substantially slower tempo for these singing bits conveys the idea of burlesque operetta, if that's one's interpretation, better than a faster tempo, quite apart from offering more contrast with the bars in between, the ones marked ruvido, or roughly, in which one can possibly imagine a drunken hiccuping. So I'll just go back one slide so you can see the bit I mean. Yeah. At bar 30, the orchestral score marks an accelerando going from crotchet equals 112 up to 126. The piano score merely indicates sempre tranquillo, as you see on screen, pretty much in direct contravention to the orchestral score. Bartók follows the latter in his recording. In my own interpretation, I adopt a middle way, somewhat underplaying the accelerando, which sounds perhaps little bit too organised, given the topic, so I tend to keep the speed perhaps a bit more stable, but with a hint of accelerando. However, where I do follow the orchestral score is including a fairly substantial writ in bars 40 to 41. That's on screen there, but it's not marked in the piano score at all, as you can see. Bartók includes a huge writ in his recording from bar 37. I start mine a little later, but I do include one because quite apart from the pictorial element or the topic element, it also serves a separate function, a structural function, as preparation for the abbreviated recapitulation. Now, the recapitulation starts at bar 42, with crotchet equals 88 marked in the orchestral score. There is no marking in the piano score. But going at roughly the same speed as at the opening makes sense structurally. A substantial accelerando is if the drunk is gradually losing control, then leads to vivace, crotchet equals 144 at bar 50. That's shown on screen there, and the orchestral score. Again, the piano score has no such indication. But in this instance, I do follow the piano score, and indeed Bartók's recording, to make a kind of tumbling forwards effect. And also, it kind of prepares one for the end. Bartók, in his recording, certainly does carry out this accelerando, but he reaches full speed, in fact, well before bar 51. Here he is. In play was that, and you'll notice that those spread chords he plays quite quickly. At this sort of I personally prefer something a bit slower. Because it just sounds more drunk to me, done like that. And a little bit less organised, as if someone's rolling around. During the last few bars, the only tempo change indicated by the piano score is poco sostenuto over the anacrusis into the last bar. Indeed, prior to this score, the indication in the piano part is non rubato, which is a little surprising, given that, as I say, the drunk seems to have been losing control before then. However, both the orchestral score and Bartók's recording do put in a substantial ritenuto. If the final gesture can be taken to represent the drunk sliding onto the ground, then this slowing down makes pictorial sense as well as musical sense in that it betokens the end. A quick word about articulation. The quavers at the opening in the piano score are marked staccato, but with a small tenuto on the second and fourth and sixth of the quavers. In the orchestral score, these offbeat quavers are marked as slurs, and this is how they sound when so executed. Personally, I prefer the lean to the slur. Again, it sounds a bit less organised, more like an irregular walk, especially when it's combined with an unsteady pulse and rubato. At the very opening there in the piano score, you see we've got these grace note chords in the left hand leading on to quaver chords in the right hand. Bartók plays the grace notes very close to the chord, something like this. I prefer a little more detachment. Again, I just feel that gives it a slightly more character, slightly more drunken feel to the music. And And a final word about dynamics. There's a lot I could say, but I'm confining myself to one aspect. So for the offbeat sforzandos that are marked in bars 33 to 34, the orchestral version relies on short muted trumpet in C interjections to provide this disturbance. I've ringed them in red on screen there. However, in Bartók's recordings, the offbeat accents, which are done obviously by touch rather than by orchestral colour in the piano version, Bartók's recording of the offbeat accents, he does bring them out to some extent, and he in fact starts them earlier than marked. This is Bartók's performance. To make a little bit more of them than that, because they are such a feature of that passage. So we go from, this is the third bar on the screen. Again, it's kind of quite a disturbing effect for the audience because it sounds as though the beat has shifted. So I feel that my own performance of the burlesque is based on a synthesis of all three sources, the piano score, the Bartók recording, which obviously has a privileged status, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a blueprint for how everyone else should play it, but also the orchestral score. So I'll now play the whole piece through, and I hope you can hear the musical structure as well as the topic. And I hope you can also appreciate this musicalization of carnivalistic behavior.
Thank you very much. What a way to end the day, indeed, and thank you for the performance. I was really provoked by the notion of this idea of socially unacceptable, artistically acceptable. It can certainly cover a vast notion of sins. And it was a good reminder of sort of the the reliance on the performer really when it comes to so many things, but particularly extra musical stylistic ideas. We have some time for questions. If there's anybody in the audience, or I can start with one of my own.
Please.
How did this topic of research come up, if I can ask you?
My career in academe has been extraordinarily varied, actually, but it's always been, broadly speaking, in the area of performance. But the most recent field that I've been working in is topic theory, and one thing had struck me was that there's a lot of work out there about topic theory, but very little of it relates to performance. A little bit about, like, early examples of standard musical analysis just ignored performance completely. And then, of course, eventually the performers got in and started to claim their ground back. And I think that's what I've been trying to do with topic theory. However, in terms of this particular piece, I'll tell you a little bit of history. I learnt the 3 burlesques, and I was thinking at the time, why are they called burlesques? I suppose they are quite entertaining. The first one's supposed to be a quarrel. The last one, we really don't know what it is. This one, because my French isn't very good and I don't speak Hungarian at all, the title had the Hungarian, and on the other side it said un peu gris, which I thought meant a little grey. Actually, in French, gris means grey and tipsy. So I completely misinterpreted it the first time I played it. So I gave it a terrible performance, to be honest. And then it came to my attention that it actually meant drunk. And that absolutely, totally changed my entire view of the piece. And also I thought, well, is this a topic? Is this a musical topic? And I would say, yes, it is, because it informs the whole piece. And I think once, hopefully, I pointed out to you that the depiction of this piece is drunkenness, then it is evident to you as listeners that that's what it's all about. And so you've got the extra musical, but you can't lose sight of the introversive, of the kind of structural elements either, otherwise it just has no structural sense at all. So I hope that answers.
Yeah, very fascinating, very interesting. Do we have any questions? We are...
Stun them into silence.
You stun them into silence.
Yeah,
You've answered everybody's questions. Well, with that, well, thank you very, very much.